All right, so today we're going to take a deep dive into something uh, pretty major, a pretty big shift actually, in global affairs,
Yeah,
the recent suspension of U.S. foreign aid.
that's huge.
And specifically, we're going to kind of zero in on what it means when USAID funding dries up.
Yeah.
What are the on-the-ground consequences of that?
Yeah, it's a really critical time to be looking at this, especially given just how much USAID does, around the world,
Right.
in terms of, humanitarian assistance, economic development, strengthening democratic institutions. I mean, it's really a massive undertaking.
It's a huge organization.
Yeah.
And to give you a sense of scale, back in fiscal year 2023, USA moved over $40 billion
Wow.
globally. And a big chunk of that, I think it was $1.676 billion,
Yeah, that's right.
went to Ethiopia. And, you might be wondering why Ethiopia, why so much focus there?
Well, the country is in a really, really difficult position right now. They're
Mm.
still grappling with the aftermath of a really long and really brutal civil war. And on top of that, they're dealing with severe drought and just massive food shortages.
Yeah, a lot of overlapping crises.
We're talking about 20 million people in desperate need of aid. This isn't just like nice to have help. This is life or death stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the crucial context for, a really big policy shift that happened in January of 2025,
Right.
when then President Trump signed an executive order, sort of under the banner of America First,
Right.
and this order suspended foreign aid, including this absolutely vital funding, from USAID that we've just been discussing.
So billions of dollars, a lot of it earmarked for a country that's, kind of on the edge,
Yeah.
dealing with war and natural disaster, and suddenly that gets frozen.
So in this deep dive, what we're really trying to do is figure out, what's the real cost? What are the consequences of this big change in, the way America's been doing foreign aid for a long time?
Yeah, what happens when you pull that lever?
Yeah, we're going to look at the immediate shock waves, the ripple effects, not just in Ethiopia, but around the world. We've got a bunch of sources that kind of illuminate the complexity of this whole thing.
Right.
So let's start by sort of drilling down on Ethiopia itself. What was USA doing there before this suspension hit?
Yeah, so they had a pretty significant presence, doing a whole bunch of different things. It wasn't just about, handing out supplies during an emergency.
Right.
They were really deeply involved in building long-term stability and, providing essential services.
Right.
The kind of things that a lot of us take for granted.
Mhm.
For a lot of communities across Ethiopia, U.S. sales was really like a tangible symbol of hope for the future.
It makes sense. So that $1.676 billion allocation, what were the key areas where that was supposed to go? I mean, we talked about the drought, the conflict, the resulting food insecurity.
Exactly. That funding was absolutely essential for, directly addressing those interconnected crises.
Right.
And when you think about the scale of the food shortages, I mean, if that support gets reduced
Right.
or cut off altogether, the potential for widespread famine is really frightening.
Yeah, it's a scary thought.
Yeah, it's a huge humanitarian emergency.
Yeah.
And that level of aid was designed to kind of provide a buffer against, the absolute worst outcomes.
And there was one particular initiative that really stood out in the stuff that we were reading about, the Markets for Sanitation Project,
Oh, yeah.
M4S.
M4S, yeah.
It kicked off in November of 2024 with a $31 million budget, and it seemed to have kind of a unique approach. Can you tell us a little bit more about what it was trying to achieve?
Yeah, so what's really interesting about the M4S project is that it was about trying to create lasting solutions, not just, temporary Band-Aids.
Yeah.
It was aimed at providing access to basic sanitation services
Right.
for something like 5.4 million Ethiopians.
Wow.
And really importantly, it was also focused on empowering women and girls by providing 180,000 of them with menstrual hygiene products.
Yeah.
And this was spread across, a bunch of different regions in Ethiopia.
Yeah, so we're talking about impacting Tigray, Amhara, Oromia, Sidama, Somali, and a bunch of others. It was a really, truly national kind of effort.
Absolutely.
And it wasn't just about like handing out aid. It was really about building a sustainable market, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the whole idea was to stimulate a competitive market for sanitation goods and services
Right.
so that these essential items wouldn't just be, available, that they'd be affordable and accessible over the long term.
Yeah.
It was about supporting local entrepreneurship.
Right.
And coming up with market-driven solutions that could, outlast the initial period of aid.
Right.
So it wasn't just about, short-term relief. It was about creating the conditions for lasting change.
Hmm.
Change that was owned and driven by Ethiopian communities themselves.
Yeah, and we even have a quote here from Scott Hocklander, who is the USAI Ethiopia Mission Director.
Right.
And he described the mission as unlocking the power of markets to drive change and give Ethiopian citizens ownership of that change.
It's a great quote.
Yeah, it really gets at the heart of the long-term impact they were going for.
Yeah.
So with this sudden suspension of funding, what happens to projects like M4S?
Yeah. So unfortunately, the suspension basically throws these really vital initiatives into limbo.
Right.
All that momentum that they'd built up, the tangible progress they were making towards setting up these sustainable solutions.
Right.
It's all in jeopardy now. It's not just, the delivery of services stops immediately, but it also undermines that whole long-term vision of empowering communities
Right.
to kind of take control of their own development.
Yeah, it's a real setback. So we've been focusing on Ethiopia, but the impact of this aid suspension isn't limited to just one country.
Yeah, that's right.
We're also seeing pretty significant effects elsewhere.
Yeah.
So let's shift our attention to India.
Okay.
And specifically the transgender community there.
Yeah, this is where you really start to see how interconnected these global aid programs are.
Yeah.
So in India, USAID was supporting 7 different projects to the tune of $750 million in the 2023-24 fiscal year.
Wow.
According to the Finance Ministry's latest report.
Right.
And a good chunk of that money was going directly towards, helping the transgender community.
Yeah, and specifically there were these miter clinics in Hyderabad, Thane, and Pune.
Right.
And they were providing some really, really essential services to a population that is, often incredibly vulnerable.
Yeah, they were really vital.
What kind of support were they actually offering?
So these clinics were a lifeline for over 6,000 transgender individuals.
Wow.
They were providing affordable and culturally sensitive health care,
Right.
including really important HIV treatment and just a whole range of other, vital services.
Yeah.
They created this really safe and accessible space for a community that often faces, huge barriers to getting proper medical care.
So what happens when the funding suddenly disappears for these clinics?
Yeah, well, tragically, the miter clinics have had to close down.
Why?
Which means that thousands of, very vulnerable people have lost access to the critical medical support that they'd come to depend on. It's a very direct and immediate human cost of this policy shift.
Yeah, it's a powerful illustration of, the real world consequences.
Yeah.
So beyond these specific projects, there's also this bigger question about global health. And the head of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, has been pretty outspoken about this.
Yes, he has.
What are his main concerns?
Well, this really brings up a crucial point about the wider impact on global health security.
Right.
Dr. Tedros has expressed some really deep concern about the fact that, tens of billions of dollars in U.S. overseas aid have been frozen. And he's specifically highlighted the potential disruption to programs that are tackling some really major global health challenges.
Right.
Things like HIV, polio eradication efforts,
Right.
outbreaks of mpox, even, the monitoring and prevention of avian influenza.
So this policy shift that's all about America first could end up setting back global health initiatives that affect everybody, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
These are all areas where you really need sustained international cooperation and funding to be effective.
It's a global problem.
It is.
So let's talk about the reasons behind this decision.
Okay.
Our sources point to some pretty significant policy shifts within the U.S. government.
Yeah.
And they also offer some interesting historical context. So what are the main arguments for and against these big aid cuts?
Well, at the heart of this debate is, a really fundamental disagreement about priorities and about America's role in the world.
Right.
Critics of the aid suspension argue that these cuts are not only going to make things worse for people who are already incredibly vulnerable, but they also risk damaging U.S. influence in key regions where other global players like China and Russia are expanding their presence. Their argument is that by pulling back on aid and support, the U.S. is basically creating a vacuum that these other actors will be happy to fill. And that could be really bad for U.S. interests in the long run.
And on the other side, you have the America First perspective.
Exactly.
Which is really focused on domestic concerns.
That's right. The idea is that U.S. taxpayer money should be spent primarily on addressing needs here at home.
Right. It's a debate about, where should we be spending our money?
Yeah. And what should America's role be on the global stage?
Yeah, right. And to really understand the long-term consequences, it's helpful to think about history.
Yeah, absolutely.
Our sources point out that after World War II,
right,
U.S. policymakers realized that there was this really strong connection between development assistance and global security.
Right.
Big initiatives like the Marshall Plan were really instrumental in stabilizing Western Europe and East Asia.
Yes.
And, arguably preventing future conflict. And this experience led to this broader understanding that investing in development overseas wasn't just charity.
Yeah.
It was also a smart strategy for protecting U.S. interests.
Right. It was a key part of their long-term security strategy.
So cutting aid to a country like Ethiopia, which has made a lot of progress with U.S. support, could actually backfire and make things less stable.
Yeah, you risk undoing years of hard work.
Right. So it seems like we're at a pretty important crossroads.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
What are the experts saying about the future of all this?
Well, the general consensus seems to be that we need a more careful and nuanced approach.
Right.
It's not necessarily about, completely abandoning aid.
Right.
But it's about finding a better balance between domestic priorities and international responsibilities.
Right, yeah.
The argument is that maintaining leadership in global development isn't just a moral issue.
Yeah.
It's also in America's own best interests.
Yeah. So ultimately, policymakers have this really big decision to make.
Yeah.
Do they stick with the commitment to international aid?
Right.
Or do they turn inward and risk the potential fallout?
That's the question.
Yeah.
And it's one with some pretty significant implications.
Yeah, so let's just take a minute to recap what we've talked about today.
Right.
We've looked at the suspension of USAID funding under this America First policy.
Right.
We've seen the immediate effects, things like the disruption of those sanitation projects in Ethiopia.
Now,
the closure of those healthcare clinics for the transgender community in India, and the concerns being raised by global health organizations. And we've highlighted the tension between this focus on domestic policy and the potential consequences for global stability and humanitarian needs.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
So here's something to think about as we wrap up. The challenges we're facing globally are all interconnected.
Yeah, they are.
And aid has historically been a big part of how we've dealt with them.
Right.
So as we see these big changes happening in aid commitments, what are the long-term consequences?
Yeah.
Both the obvious ones and the ones that are harder to see.
Right. What are the unintended consequences?
Yeah, for a world that's, increasingly interconnected.
Yeah, it's a question worth pondering.
It really is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Absolutely.
We'll see you next time.
See ya.
Bye.